Okay, so going back to the analogy we talked about yesterday, um, if we think about a web page as a human body, we talked about how the HTML is the skeleton, and we saw yesterday pretty much how to create a lot of the most common components or the most common pieces of a web page, right? So things like paragraphs, divs, or sorry, paragraphs, text, lists, images, links, etc. And then we said the next thing that we wanted to kind of layer on top of that skeleton will be the skin, or really the things that make it pretty. And so that's essentially what CSS is. It is a language in of itself, but typically speaking, people think of it more in terms of the functionality, right? And the functionality of CSS, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And for the first part, we'll talk about the style portion of it, and then in the second part, we'll talk about the cascading part of it. But the goal of CSS, once again, is just to take the raw basic HTML components that we've built yesterday, and now let's add some more things in there to make it a little bit more user friendly, more colorful, and more useful. Now, CSS, it may seem like it's a decorative piece of the website, which it is, but that by no means doesn't mean that's not important, right? If you remember like the websites from like the 1980s, right? Pretty much it was all just plain text. They were very hard to read. It was very hard to convey complex information. And so whereas CSS may seem like it's just something that makes things pretty, there is a lot of practical use to having a well-designed and a well-styled website as well. So CSS rules. Um, Basically, with CSS, the only things that we really care about are just figuring out which elements we want to do something to and what we actually want to do to them, right? With any CSS that we write, once again, all we're saying is, I want to do X to these elements. I want to do this thing to these elements. And so we want to make sure from the very beginning that we're choosing the right elements. And then once we choose them, we're actually also executing the correct instructions or the correct changes on them too. So here in this case, a little bit meta, but essentially, if we take a look at the CSS on the bottom there, and I'll walk through what that means later on. But essentially, what this is, hey, take all list items and change the color of the text to blue. And indeed, the two bullets that we were just looking at right above it, they're now blue. Okay, so what we're gonna learn the syntax for writing CSS rules. We're gonna talk about the different ways in which we can choose and select which elements we want to take a look at on the page, and then we'll talk about some of the ways we are able to change some of the ways we are able to change the information, right? So whereas this HTML is the content and the CSS is the style, when we add them together, we get the actual web layout of the page. Okay, so to just really drive this point home, hopefully the page is the side is pretty clear. On the left hand side, we see a page on Stack Overflow, and once again, right, notice how kind of pretty it is, but not just pretty, how the colors and the styling really help us tell a story. The big header at the top tells us, hey, this is a page about CSS. We see some text on the bottom, and then we see this gray box, and in the gray box we see these different lines of text, and we know that this is not just plain text, this is actually a sample snippet of a CSS code. On the bottom, we see a Learn More link separated by a bar to know that this is separate from the content itself. And then even on the header on the far right side, we have all these kind of tools, right? We can pick the languages we want to read this in. We can edit the page if we so choose, or maybe modify some other settings on the page as well. So this is an example of a well laid out website, right? We take a look at it, we kind of know what it's trying to do. All the things we need to toggle or tweak or play with are pretty self-explanatory and pretty clearly labeled on the page. On the right hand side is basically this website without CSS, right? Every word that you see on the left hand side is on the right hand side somewhere. But as you can tell, it's just a lot more painful to read, right? There's not as much direction and guidance on where things start, where things end, how the different pieces of information are different from one another. And we have all these links at the very bottom, but we can read the text, but once again, they're not grouped together in a way that makes it easy for us to understand what's going on. And so sorry, and so sorry, just to wrap up the thought here is you can make a website without CSS, but just remember that CSS at this point, it's no longer like an optional thing you can do to dress it up. It's actually a very imperative part of any website design. Okay, so let's think about the terms, or really how we define the parts of a CSS. We'll call it a selector or a statement. Okay, there's a few parts here, and maybe here we're making it a bit complicated, but for now, everything we need to know is color coded. So this entire thing here, this entire block of code, this is called a rule. Okay, a rule basically is in CSS that just says what that basically says is take these elements and do this to them. Okay, and if we break it out a little bit further now, the part that's highlighted here, this is called a declaration. This part says what do we want to do to these things. Okay, the reason why we know that it's a rule is because notice how it's being notice how on the first line we have a curly brace, and notice how on the last line we have a curly brace. The curly braces pretty much in CSS help us designate everything within the curly brace are the changes we want to make, and then everything that comes before the curly brace are the changes, or sorry, are the text or the code that we use to select the elements. Okay, so in this case, everything inside this curly brace is going to be changes that we want to make, and each line of change or each individual change is separated at the end of the line by a semicolon. So here, the first declaration that we see, it says border colon 1px space solid space red. Now, what is so now the most important thing to know in a declaration is kind of where it starts, where the separation is, and where it ends. So where does it start? It starts with border, and what border is border basically is, or actually let me back up. Border is what we call the property. What is the property? The property is which part of this element am I trying to change, right? And in fact, here we actually have two declarations. The first one starts with border, and the second one starts with font style. And so it's pretty clear now these two rules are trying to do, sorry, these two declarations are trying to do very different things. The first one is trying to modify something with the border, and the second declaration is trying to change something to the font. Okay, and we know that that's where the property starts, because the property ends whenever you see that colon. In this case, you see the colon after border, and then on the second declaration, you see the colon after font style. Everyone good so far? Cool. And then everything between the colon and the semicolon is going to be the actual change, right? What do you actually want to change that property to? So here, the question becomes, okay, so now I know that this declaration is changing the border. What do I want to change it to? In this case, I want to change it to 1 pixel wide. It's a solid line, and the color of it is red. And so all of these things are what we call values. These are the values that or this is the value that we're trying to change the property into. Okay, so on the first declaration here, we see that we're trying to change the border into 1 pixel solid red, and we'll talk more about the sample values and the possible values later on. But for now, just kind of know where the things are different, or the different things are laid out. And then in the second declaration, we're trying to change the font style, and we're trying to change it to italics. No. So let me go back a little bit. So I should do this in different order. So the things we do up here. So everything that comes before the curly brace. This is what we call the selector, right? So this enables us to pick which elements are we actually doing this. Are we making these changes to, right? If I want to make, for example, if I want to make in the previous example, we saw that the header, for example, was a bolded font. Well, I don't want to just kind of blindly make everything bold on the page, right? I want to say only take the header element and make that bold. And so we'll talk about the syntax for selecting these things as well. But for now, I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on the breakout. So once again, everything in the curly brace is saying let's apply these rules. Everything before the curly brace says apply these rules to elements that match this selector, and then this entire thing is one rule for CSS. And so when you think of a style sheet, you can just think of it as a collection of rules saying, hey, take this element and change the font. Take this element, change the color. Take this element, change the background color. Take this element, change the italicism or other properties of it. And that's pretty much all CSS is. Now, selectors are basically a way for us to so let's start by thinking about how we actually pick the elements we want to make the changes to, and then we'll talk about the changes themselves. Okay, so here, if you notice, I have a very simple link element, right? We saw the link elements yesterday. They're an A tag, and notice how here I have a bunch of things. In the A tag itself, I have the class attribute, right? It says class equals David. I have the ID attribute equals full stack, and I also have the href attribute equals the URL itself. With all these attributes, make sure that whatever value you use, you're putting it inside the quotes. Okay, that's very important because that's the only way that CSS, or sorry, that's the only way that HTML is going to know kind of where your value ends. All right, and so here I have an A tag with 3 attributes: a class value, an ID value, and an href value. Well, the easiest way for me then to pick out this element is for me to use a variety of ways to identify out of all the elements on the page, this is the one that I want. And so the answer, so the couple ways for us to do this are either by tag, or by class, by ID, by attribute, by pseudo element, or by pseudo class, and we'll walk through each one of these individually. What does it mean when I want to access it by tag? Well, by tag, it just means, hey, pick all of these kinds of tags on the page. Okay, and so in this case, if I want to pick the element on this page here, well, what kind of tag is it? It's an A tag, right? It's a link tag. And so if I just write down the name of the selector, if I just write A, then that basically tells CSS to say, hey, grab all the A tag, grab all the A elements on the page. Now, that might work if all I have is one A element on the page. But what if I want to be a little bit more specific? What if I say I only want to group a certain subset or a certain group of tags with another value? Well, now, and hopefully I forgot who asked yesterday. Maybe it was Katie, maybe it was someone else who asked why we need class and ID attributes. Here we can see with CSS why having additional ways to identify these elements becomes really important now. Because now I can also say, hey, grab all of the tags with this particular class value. And the way we identify a class value is we do dot and then the name of the class. So here if I want to pick out all the classes, all the elements with a class that's equal to David, all I do is dot David. And then last but not least, if I want to pick out something based on ID, well then in that case, all I have to do is the same thing as before. I say, give me all the elements with this ID. And remember what we talked about yesterday, right? IDs should be unique. Whenever we use an ID, there should only be one element on the page with that ID. A lot of pages now, if you try to write an HTML doc with multiple IDs of the same value, they'll actually flag you as an error saying, hey, do you mind fixing this? And the way for us to identify the ID value is with the hashtag or the #, depending on how you look at it. And so we won't cover attributes, pseudo attributes, and pseudo class for now. Just know that there are additional ways for us to select the different types of elements. But the most common ones that we're going to deal with are going to be, you can identify a given element or a group of elements by either their tag, or by their class, or by their ID, or a combination of those values. And we'll see a few examples of that coming up as well. But essentially, this is what comes before the curly brace when you write a CSS rule. These are the ways for you to say, I'm about to make these changes to these elements, and these elements basically are any elements that followed the selection criteria that you make here. Does this make sense to people? Are there any questions? Everyone's good? Any questions at all? Perfect. Yep. You mean search by a pattern as opposed to actual value? Yeah, so there's ways to do that. We won't cover it in this class. There's something called regex that allows us to search based on patterns to say, I want all tags in which the first the first character is a number, and the next 5 characters are letters or something like that. There's no simple wildcard the way that you're thinking about it without using regex. So the short answer is there is a way to do it based on pattern, but it won't be something that we talk about here. Here, whenever you select a tag, you kind of, for now, we'll say you need to give us the exact precise value that you're looking for. Yeah. Any other questions from folks? All right. So as we mentioned earlier, there's a way for us to select these based on these criteria one at a time, or we can also select it based on, we can combine these criteria together, right? So now you can imagine it's easy for us to say, hey, give me all the A tags on the page that also have, a class value of David. So let's take a look at what these means, right? Whenever you see something that's tag and then dot class, and in the selector criteria, that just means give me an element with both that tag value and also that class value. Okay, and so in this case, if I want to do it for the element that we have written up here, I would do a dot David. Everyone follow so far? Right, because the A says give me all the elements with the A tag, and then the dot David connected means give me all the elements with the A tag that also have a class value of David. If you look at the second example, it looks very similar. The only difference now is that there's a white space, there's a blank space between tag and dot class. And so whenever we see a tag with a space and then dot class, all that means is give us all of the elements with that class value whose parent matches the tag value. Okay, so basically only give me an element with a class if the parent of that element matches that's given tag value. This is something that it's a little bit more complex, but you can think of it as to say, hey, I only want to modify all the text inside a header div, for example, right? If a header div has a class of header, then I say, okay, I only want to modify, for example, all of the list items inside a given list, then I would I could add a class to each individual list item and say only modify the things with that class who are children of that tag. This one you'll see a little bit more of when you do the workshop. It's a little bit hard to explain very theoretically, but just know that with the space in between just means is that now there's a sequential. Now we're actually looking for a specific parent-child relationship. If I do tag comma dot class, hopefully very self-explanatory, that just means give me all the elements that have either or both, right? Either or is fine, but it needs at least one of those two criteria. So it needs to either at least be that tag value or have that class value. And then here's tag and then the caret sign dot class. What this means is it's very similar to the space dot class. The only difference is, and we can think of this in the idea of a family tree, is when we say parent, we just mean the div, the container right above the child matches that given tag value. Ancestor means no matter how many parents they have, if at least one of the parent divs have that tag value, then we can use it. Once again, this is something that will make a lot more sense in the workshops once you take a look at real code. But for now, this is just a way of us telling you that you can also combine, you can mix and match these different types of rules to say I want to select only the elements that fit this criteria. Before we go any further, just one more thing to write to and we'll do this for every language. So we did it for HTML yesterday. We'll do it for CSS today. The way to write comments inside a CSS document is to use this backspace asterisk, and then you can also end the comment with an asterisk backspace. And so just like yesterday, comments are just lines of code that the computer more or less doesn't read or completely skips over. They can go on multiple lines. They can go on the same line as code, like we see on line 3 here, as long as it's very clearly denoted. And they're basically ways for you to leave messages for future programmers, either to explain or to clarify or to do something else. So yeah, so this is the syntax for writing a comment in CSS. Now we're going to talk about some of the properties, but before we do, are there any questions about anything I've talked about so far with regards to kind of how CSS works, or any questions about the role of selectors? The detail stuff? Yep. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So we'll go through this cascading portion of this fairly quickly too, because we want to get you kind of up there and working, right. So all cascading just means is if you think of a cascading, usually we say in terms of waterfalls. The idea of cascading is basically things is a sequence of is a sequence in which different things feed into each other, right? If you think of a waterfall, it's like the first level falls in the second level, which then falls in the third level, which then falls to the ground, for example, right? Um, Style sheets are very often operates in a very similar way, and the reason for that is because oftentimes what happens is you have multiple CSS rules trying to change the same exact element. Okay, let me say that one more time. Actually, and in general, it's probably true. In most cases, when you go to a website and you see an HTML element, in a vacuum, what if you actually kind of read the code and dig through it, well, you'll realize that there are multiple different rules trying to change the same element in very possibly the same way. And so when we look at the element, the final result of the element that we see is basically that element's style is a merge of all the rules that apply to that element. But obviously, if one rule says the background color is green and one says the background color is red, only one of those rules can win or actually be applied. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of how CSS picks which rule wins or which rule ultimately gets applied. Okay. Um, One of the things that will do a lot and that you'll see a lot of in the workshops is so with regards to CSS rules on the property on the rule side, we've talked a little bit about how we select the documents, or sorry, how we select the elements. In terms of the actual changes we want to make to it, there's so many properties for us to take a look at that we're actually just going to go through a few of them very quickly here on the slides. But really, the bulk of them will walk you through in the actual Learn.platform itself. And the reason why is because, as you can imagine, different elements have different properties you can manage, right? If I look at, for example, just a line of text, I can modify the size, I can modify the color of the text, I can modify the background color of the text. If I'm looking at an image tag, well, I can't modify the image, or sorry, I can't modify the color of the image, not in the way that we think we do, we can anyway. And we also can't modify the font of the image, right? And so the properties are actually things that are correspond very directly to each individual tag type. And so in your reading, you'll go through a lot more detail about what are some of the common rules or properties that apply to each tag type. But for now, let's just take a look at what we have here. On the top left-hand box under index.html, we have our head and our body containers. And the head container, that just tells us, hey, there are two style sheets that are going to be applied to it. You can ignore what the link tag means for now. Just know that in the head right now, we're basically saying to the right of it, styles a.css is going to apply to this page, as well as styles b.css is going to apply to this page. Then when we go to the body tag, notice how in it there's one element, a UO element, so that stands for unordered list, and inside that unordered list we have one list item, right? And the list item is just the character A. Now, notice how all the different things are kind of happening here, right? In the HTML document itself, notice how inside that list element there, inside the unordered list, inside the body, notice how there is an attribute called style. And in the attribute called style, notice how we're actually setting the background color equal to blue, right? This is one way to choose style documents, and we call it inline styling. It's usually not preferred because, as you can imagine, if a page has so many of these, it gets messy very, very quickly. But it is one way for us to add a style component to the element. If you look in styles a.css, notice how all this document has is a very, very simple CSS rule, right? What comes before the curly brace? Li. And what does that mean? That means because there's no dot in front of it, I know I'm not looking at a class, and because there's no pound sign in front of it, I know I'm not looking at an ID. So instead, I'm just looking at just a tag value. So now I know I'm looking at all the list tags on this page. How many list tags are on this page? There's only one in this unordered list, right? We see it inside the unordered list, and it has the character A in it. And if we look at the property that we're trying to change for this list item, we're trying to change the color, and we're setting it equal to red. Just so we're clear, when we say color here, this means text color, not background color. Background color, as we can see, is the name of the property is different. It's background dash color. Okay, and so now already we kind of see this phenomenon where, okay, in the HTML itself, using inline styles. Hello, Johanna, do you have a question? Okay. Yep. Yeah, we could hear you. You're good. Let's make sure you didn't have a question. Yeah. So now we already see, right, in the list item in the HTML itself, we now added this style attribute that's changing the background color to equal blue. In styles a.css, I've now also selected all the list items and saying, hey, can you change the font color to red? And then if I look at styles b.css, I'm once again getting all the list items, except now I'm saying, hey, let's change the font size to 40 pixels. And so what's going to happen when this entire document runs, when we apply all three forms of style to this element? The answer is, well, because all three of these different types of styles are non-conflicting, which means I can change the background color using the inline style, and it doesn't override or conflict with any of the other rules. One which changes font color, or one which changes font size. I can actually apply all three rules simultaneously. And so what's going to happen is in my elements direct inline style, I see that now I've set the background color equal to blue. If I look at the list color, if I look at the color of the text in the list item, I'll see the color is red. And if I want to take a look at the font size of the element, well, stylesb.css change that by setting the font size equal to 40. And so this kind of gets this idea that every element that we see, the final style is just a combination of all of the styles that have come before it. And so when we actually create this document or create this element, I'm sorry, this is kind of how it looks. You see the dot in the beginning because this is once again a list item. I see that my background color is blue. I see that my text color is red. And then finally, I see that my font size is bigger than normal. So we can assume here that that's 40 pixels, right? And so when we have multiple styles being applied to the same element, all of these styles get applied as long as they're not conflicting. Oh, and we'll talk more about what happens when they do conflict. But are there any questions here so far? Yes, Trudy, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so usually when we make a web page, you actually see that it's not just one document; it's actually a folder full of documents. And usually speaking, we'll have one sheet for the HTML, and then we'll have another separate document where we just list out all the styles. Um, I don't want to get into this too much right now because it gets very hairy very quickly. But in yeah, okay, yeah. No problem. And then the last connection I'll make here is just once again, if we look in the HTML file here in the example on this page, in the head, that's where we link the different files together. And we do it with this tag called a link tag. That basically says, oh, this other document relates to this web page in some way. In this case, we're linking a bunch of style sheets to this HTML document. Yep. No, great question. Any other questions? Okay, so now this kind of we come to like kind of the last part of this class, which is, well, what happens when declarations conflict, right? What if I'm trying to change, for example, the color of the font of this element in one place, but then somewhere else I'm trying to change the color of font in the other place? Um, and this gets even hairier, even more quickly. And what we want to kind of understand here is that in this case, with regards to CSS, there is a hierarchy, or at least there is an order in which rules get applied, right? So what does that mean? Well, for example, if we think about even in our current life, right? Obviously, there are legal rules that kind of prevent what we can do or not do on a day-to-day basis. But if you start in a company, this company might also have rules, right? And that apply to your behavior. Now, these rules are probably not going to conflict with the government's rules that we talked about, but in fact, these rules might be even more stringent, right? So, for example, in the US at least, we can talk about having freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want as loudly as I want. But if I start my job at a company, maybe a policy inside the company is, hey, don't yell, right? Or don't raise your voice. And then if I start on a team in a company, this team might have even more rules as well. And so the question becomes, well, which rules do I follow? And the answer is, well, you follow the rules that are kind of more that are most specific or most relevant to you, right? Like the U.S. government's rules are supposed to apply to the entire country, the populace of the entire country. The company's rules are going to apply to everyone who works for the company, and your team's rules are going to apply just to your team, right? And so as these rules kind of start getting more and more narrowed down, you kind of see how they also become more relevant to you as well. And so this is kind of the same convention that CSS follows as well. Obviously, to the analogy that I just gave, obviously we never want to contradict laws as opposed to rules. But the point here is to say that a lot of times when we have multiple rules that affect the same thing, what matters is who am I, what do I want to do this to? And more importantly, for the element I'm doing this to, how specific am I in actually picking this change? Let me say it in another way. How many elements theoretically am I going to change with this rule? And essentially, I want to prioritize the rule that is most specific to a given element, right? And so here, notice how at the top of the page, I have a simple div tag with the ID value of thing. Now, I have two rules that are both trying to change the background color of this element. And the rule on the sorry, and the rule on the left, I have my div selector, so saying, hey, pick all div tags, and then my rule says set the background equal to red. On the right hand side, I have my hashtag thing, so I'm saying, hey, give me all the elements that have the ID of thing, which once again should only be one element, and change the background to blue. Well, when I run both of these rules against each other simultaneously, which one wins? The rule that uses the ID wins, and that's because in our hierarchy, ID is the most specific way for us to select an element, right? Div could apply to thousands, if not more, tags theoretically, right? The ID selector is always only going to apply to only one element, and so if whenever CSS sees us trying to make a change to a given ID based on a certain ID, it will say, well, because this is so selective, then this must be the most important rule that I should be prioritizing, and therefore in this case, the ID selector, so hashtag thing, takes precedence or takes priority level over the div tag selector. If we look at another example, then hopefully this is going to be a little bit more intuitive here now. I still have my element above, except now rather than have an ID, I now have a class value, and I set it equal to foo. And so on my left-hand side, I still have the same rule as before. It's a tag selector, a div selector. I'm trying to change the background equal to red. And then on the right-hand side, I have another rule that selects this element based on the class, right? Dot foo means give me all elements with a class of foo, and it is trying to change the background color to green. When I set up these two rules against each other, which one wins? The class rule wins, right? Because once again, the idea is that class is a little bit more selective or a bit more descriptive or a bit more precise than a tag selector is. And so the hierarchy becomes ID first, then class, and then tag. This making sense to folks? So we'll just have a few more of these rules, and I'll go through them, and then we'll kind of get you started on the workshop problem, because I think a lot of this only makes sense once you actually start working on it kind of in more detail. Okay, so here I'm trying to compare an ID against a class value, but not just one class value, two class values, right? I have my div, I have my ID value of thing, but on the class side, in class, I actually have two classes. One class is called foo, and in the class value, when you have a space in the middle, that means you're trying to apply multiple classes to this element. So here I'm trying to apply the class foo and also the class bar, right? And so on my left hand side, I have my ID rule, hashtag thing, change the background to blue. On my right hand side, I have .foo.bar, which means give me an element that has both a class value foo as well as a class value bar, and change the background color to green. And when I set these rules against each other, which one wins? The ID still wins. Why? Because in theory, the ID should be the most precise. And so the number of classes don't really matter, right? Once again, just to kind of reiterate, the precedence goes ID first, ID first, then class, and then tag. And then last but not least, we can kind of see here, I'm not sure if it's extremely clear to us, but on the left-hand side, we're trying to change the font size to 30 pixels based on the ID tag. On the right-hand side, there's a space between the dot outer and the dot foo. And what that space is saying is give me all the elements with the class value foo that are that who has a parent with the outer class, and change the background color to green. And the idea is which rule wins? Well, the one that wins is actually the one that we didn't talk about, which is the style that we actually put inside the line itself. And the reason why this style becomes the most important one is because when we take a look at the precedence, then even though the CSS allows us to pick elements to select different elements, whatever goes in the HTML actually has the topmost precedence, because it's, once again, we call it inline styling. We're basically trying to modify the style of the element in the moment. Now, one thing that's a bit misleading about this is the right hand rule, that .outer.foo, the background color of green, that won't be applied, right? Because background orange is going to take precedence over that. We're going to say make the background orange over make the background green. However, the left hand rule with the dot thing, that rule will still be applied. And the reason why that will be applied is because when we look at the font size, we'll notice that font size doesn't necessarily conflict with color, right? The background color can be orange, but the font size can still be 30. And so here's an example where these two, where in cases, so this is another example of we have a single element whose appearance, whose style is being changed by multiple sources. And as long as those sources don't conflict, we are able to apply as many changes as we want. However, when those changes do conflict, obviously we kind of fall back to this idea of precedence, as in some changes take a higher priority level than others. And last but not least, hopefully this plays. Yep. So this is a very common cartoon that people share about CSS. If you ever dealt with these blinds, you know the feeling. You feel like you're going to change one thing and then everything else breaks. CSS, don't get me wrong, as you can even tell by the slides I've shared today, it can be an extremely frustrating process. A lot of times, if you go on Stack Overflow, you'll see a ton of people with these very complex, very convoluted CSS applications. So if this is confusing or if this doesn't work right away out of box, do not feel bad. This is extremely tedious, and usually when I'm designing websites, CSS is one of the things I dread doing because it's just so complicated and there's so many things to consider, right? If I'm trying to style one element on a page, very easy. Or I'm trying to style 100 elements on the page concurrently, I want this element to line up this way, I want this element to line up the other way, and I want the colors to be different across all of them. Well, as you can imagine, it gets very complicated very, very quickly. So are there any overarching questions on CSS before I start us on the workshop? Yeah. Yes. Okay, cool. Sorry, I thought that there was more to the question, but yeah. The inline style takes precedence over anything in the CSS document. And then within the CSS document, the selectors kind of help us identify which rules take priority. Any other questions from folks?